They don't kill out of necessity. They kill to set an example. That was the final statement of an anonymous witness in an investigation into the Kenyan police's broad daylight shooting of civilians. In June 2025, Kenya burned from within. On the dusty streets of Nairobi, thousands marched with banners and chants demanding justice. It wasn't just about a blogger who died in police custody. It was something deeper, something older years of repressed fury and broken promises. At the heart of this uprising, one image turned into a symbol. Boniface Kariuki, a 22-year-old mask vendor, dropped lifeless after a direct shot to the head in broad daylight. A slow-motion camera captured that moment, as if even time itself gasped. He wasn't throwing stones, he wasn't chanting slogans. He was just standing there, and then he was gone. State television went silent. Police called it an unfortunate incident. Officials said it was an isolated act. But to Ibrahim, it was a declaration of war. Ibrahim was once a prominent human rights activist. Years ago, threats forced him into exile away from his homeland. But now he had returned not for peace, not for reconciliation, but for truth. A truth buried beneath headlines, hidden behind power soaked in fear. No one knew how Ibrahim slipped back into Kenya. No one dared shelter him. But in a country where cameras could be cut and media bought, Ibrahim knew truth must travel by voice, by memory, even by blood. And this is the story he began to tell, not written with a pen, but spoken aloud, passed from mouth to mouth, cutting through censorship, reaching the ears of Africa's children. The man who shot Boniface was not just a policeman. It was the president. People of Africa hear this call. This video is not just a story, it is a cry for justice. Share it not for likes or views, but as a prayer. Share it so that even when the oppressors silence our voices, our screens still speak. Share it so that God may see and protect the innocent among us. No one truly knows what happened behind the steel doors of Nairobi Central Police Station on the night of June 8th. Albert Ojwang, a blogger, a school teacher, a free thinker, was arrested for a single sentence. One social media post, a country where the Constitution is trash and the gun is the law. 17 words. 17 words that erased a father of two from existence within 24 hours. The police claimed he hanged himself using shoelaces. But everyone knew Albert didn't wear laced shoes. His wife Esther was the first to doubt. Suicide wasn't in his nature. Albert was a man of purpose, of conviction, of plans. On the day of his arrest, he had scheduled a lesson and promised to be home for dinner. If he wanted to die, she said he wouldn't have brought his teaching notes. Ibrahim met Esther when all other doors had closed. They sat in an abandoned church in Ruiru, lit by candlelight with Albert's wedding photo, taped to a cracked wall like a martyr's shrine. Esther opened a small wooden box. Inside lay a copy of the autopsy report, not the government's version, but an independent one conducted by a private pathologist she had bribed in secret. The paper, worn and trembling in her hands, stated, "Blunt force trauma to the skull. Contusions focused at the rear of the head. No signs of strangulation or organ damage consistent with hanging. Albert didn't hang himself. He was beaten. He died of a fractured skull." Ibrahim stared at the words, feeling the earth rumble beneath him. Not from shock, but from recognition. He had seen this pattern before, in the Congo, in Cameroon, in his own body once broken in a police cell in Kisumu 2013. The same report, the same bruises, the same blueprint of brutality stamped on every silenced life. This wasn't just Albert's story. It was a message, a warning to anyone who dared to speak. But the system had miscalculated. In killing Albert, they moved too fast, too sloppily. They thought he was just a low-level teacher, unaware he had once partnered with international NGOs, had spoken at the U.S. Embassy on critical thinking and civic responsibility. That's why his death refused to stay buried. Social media ignited. Justice for Ojwang spread like wildfire on Facebook, X, and TikTok. Other bloggers reposted his photo with a caption that echoed through the internet: "No one truly dies as long as someone tells their story." Then a photograph leaked. In the image, a plainclothes officer enters a detention cell marked Ojwang 004. On his sleeve, a barely visible patch, the insignia of Kenya's anti-riot squad. Ibrahim printed the photo and pinned it beneath a map of Kenya in his hideout. He began connecting the dots. Who was the man in the photo who authorized his access to a high-security block reserved for political detainees? Why was there no official record? The answer was glaring. This came from above. Each death carried a silent signature from the powerful, and the more people kept silent, the more bullets gained legitimacy. Ibrahim had seen this silence before. He had lived it. And he knew silence is what feeds tyrants. This wasn't just about Albert, not just for Esther. This was about millions living in fear, censoring themselves, whispering to their children, "Stay quiet, it doesn't concern us." But it did concern them. It concerned every voice buried beneath fear, every truth hidden in file cabinets, every scream muted by sirens. Ibrahim rose from his chair, his eyes burning with purpose. He whispered not as a prayer, but as a vow. "If they need a spark, I will be the first flame." It was supposed to be a peaceful march. On the morning of June 17th, hundreds gathered at City Square, Nairobi. Students, market vendors, teachers, widows, ordinary citizens wrapped in the hope that their chants might echo beyond the barriers, that someone somewhere might listen. Boniface Kariuki was among them. He had nothing to shout, nothing to throw. He wasn't even holding a placard. Boniface 22 sold face masks, 3 for 20 shillings. His kiosk had been shut down twice in the last year, blamed for public obstruction. But he wasn't a rebel. He was a survivor. Like most young men in Nairobi, he learned not to resist. He just wanted to live, until living became illegal. As the crowd moved forward, Boniface stood near the front, his small bag of masks slung across his shoulder. A loudspeaker barked warnings. Then came the crackle of boots, the glint of riot shields. The protesters, still chanting, slowed, then scattered. But Boniface stayed. He didn't run, he turned. And then one shot, straight to the head. Boniface dropped like a leaf falling too fast. His blood spilled onto the pavement, blending with the red of the Kenyan flag he had tied around his wrist. The live stream caught everything. Within minutes, the internet exploded. Boniface was unarmed, trended worldwide. Journalists from Germany, South Africa, Brazil reposted the footage. But within hours, the government declared no lethal force was authorized. They claimed the video was doctored. The policeman's identity was under investigation. The usual script, but what they didn't count on was Ibrahim. He had been watching the march from a rooftop less than 2 blocks away, his camera lens fixed on the crowd. It wasn't the first time he had documented protests from the shadows, but this time was different. When Boniface fell, Ibrahim didn't reach for his phone. He reached for his memory, because he had seen that style of shooting before. Back in 2011 in western Uganda, a student named Luca was killed with the same precision. A single shot. Close range, no warning. That bullet had a name. Ibrahim always believed that. Bullets in this system were never random. That night, Ibrahim visited the hospital, where Boniface's body was being kept under heavy police presence. He disguised himself as a cousin with forged documents. Inside the morgue, he spoke to a janitor who had recognized Boniface from the video. He was alive when they brought him in, the janitor whispered. He didn't die on the street. That changed everything. If Boniface had survived the gunshot, then he was killed inside, deliberately. And if that were true, it meant someone had given the order to finish the job. Ibrahim left the hospital with fury in his bones. He returned to his safe house and began piecing together the pattern. A blogger beaten to death in a police cell. A street vendor executed on camera. Both unarmed. Both vocal. Both within weeks of each other. He hacked into police dispatch records. Some files were encrypted, others too corrupted. But in a leaked memo from the Office of Internal Security, he found a phrase repeated twice. RTP confirmed silence critical assets before end of Q2. RTP. He had seen that acronym in a declassified cable from 2022 Ruto tactical program, an unofficial network of preventive interventions coordinated under the guise of public safety. It was real. And that's when it clicked. These weren't accidents. These weren't isolated tragedies. They were policy. Ibrahim looked back at his notes, at Boniface's name circled in red. The name had been underlined twice, just like Ojwang's. There was a list. Somewhere someone had drawn a line through names they considered threats not for violence, but for voice. Boniface was never political, but he had once spoken on a podcast saying, "The poor don't need charity, they need freedom." That was enough. Ibrahim stared at the footage again, the frame where Boniface's head jerks back, his eyes frozen open, a silent scream of betrayal. He saw more than a death. He saw the symptom of a regime sick with fear, a government that feared its own people so much it answered questions with gunpowder. And so Ibrahim made a decision. He would no longer hide behind pen names or safe houses. He would go public. He contacted an old friend, a producer at Amani TV, one of the few remaining independent networks in Nairobi. They arranged a late-night interview in secret in a secure location with multiple exit routes. But when the interview began, Ibrahim did not tremble. He brought the receipts. He showed the independent autopsy from Ojwang's death. He played the morgue workers' recording about Boniface being alive. He read the leaked RTP memo aloud. The host asked, "Who do you believe gave these orders?" Ibrahim didn't blink. "President William Ruto." The camera held still. The room was silent. The broadcast went viral. Within hours, soldiers raided Amani TV's main office. The signal was cut. Journalists were detained, but the clip had already spread. Mirrors appeared on X Telegram signal. People copied it to hard drives. They shared it through Bluetooth in crowded buses. And on the streets, murals of Boniface's face began to appear, spray-painted with the words, "His silence was louder than their bullets." The morning after the interview aired, Nairobi awoke to a different kind of silence. No traffic police at roundabouts, no government statements, no headlines in state-run papers, only whispers in buses and glances exchanged in market stalls. The name Ibrahim was no longer a rumor, it was a storm cloud, and the man in its eye had gone underground. Ibrahim knew the clock had started ticking the moment he named Ruto. Accusing a sitting president of ordering extrajudicial killings wasn't just risky, it was suicidal. But fear had long lost its grip on him. What replaced it was a righteous clarity the system would not stop unless someone forced it to trip over its own lies. He began working with the only people he could still trust, ex-journalists, underground coders, church whistleblowers. Together they traced the roots of what Ibrahim called the quiet policy, an unofficial doctrine passed through whispers, encrypted memos, and unrecorded meetings. One key source was a defected intelligence officer who once managed the government's social risk profile database. His testimony confirmed what Ibrahim feared. There existed a rotating list of potential domestic agitators, updated monthly and divided into categories. Level A, containment; Level B, surveillance; and Level C, neutralization. Albert Ojwang, Level C. Boniface, Level B, upgraded just a week before his death. Why? For being present at 2 or more unsanctioned civic gatherings. The officer also revealed the software used to manage this system, TibaNet, a state-level database initially designed for health record management during COVID-19, now repurposed to track political dissidents. It was subtle, legal on paper, but deadly in application. Ibrahim leaked this evidence to a group of African digital rights activists who immediately published a dossier, Targeted Silence: How Kenya Weaponized Health Infrastructure. The report made waves across the continent. In Ghana, Namibia, and Senegal, civil society groups called for regional investigations. The African Commission on Human and People's Rights requested access to Tibonet's architecture. The Kenyan government, under pressure, responded with dismissive confidence. There is no proof of political misuse. These are conspiracy theories. But proof was coming. Ibrahim turned his attention to finance. Every bullet, every raid, every surveillance drone, someone paid for it. By tracing state procurement logs, he discovered a web of shell companies registered in Dubai and Mauritius. One of them, AfriShield Ltd., had received over 300 million shillings in undisclosed equipment delivery contracts linked to riot control. Behind AfriShield stood a familiar name, David Koski, childhood friend of Ruto, now head of special procurement for the Ministry of Interior. Ibrahim now had a triangle. Ruto issued the silence policy. Koske channeled the funds. Police executed the operation. But what brought it all together was a phone call. Through intercepted recordings leaked by a South African telecom whistleblower, Ibrahim obtained a call between Koske and a deputy commissioner. The voice was unmistakable. "Make sure the list is done by Friday. We cannot afford another Boniface situation." And the media handled. "But if anyone talks again, pull them. RTP protocol applies." The room where Ibrahim listened to this audio went dead silent. He had the final nail. But now he faced a choice. If he published this, it would no longer be about protest or reform. It would be revolution. The streets would boil. The regime would retaliate not just with tear gas, but with disappearances, black sites, state terror. Was Kenya ready? He took a walk in Kibera that night. The slums were quieter than usual. People recognized him, but no one spoke. Just nods. One old man whispered, "We are with you, but please, don't die." He realized they didn't want a hero. They wanted a survivor. They wanted someone to finish the story, not become another name on a poster. So Ibrahim made his final move, not as a martyr, but as a tactician. He partnered with 4 African media giants: Nigeria's Sahara Reporters, South Africa's Daily Maverick, Uganda's Red Pepper, and Egypt's Mata Masser. Together they agreed to release synchronized reports, footage recordings, and financial trails at the same time, across languages and platforms. They called it the Four Corners Drop. On July 2, 2025, at exactly 8:00 p.m. Nairobi time, the first post went live, exposing Silence, the shadow system of President Ruto. Videos, maps, testimonies, financial records, voice calls, all laid bare. The illusion of order collapsed. Within hours, students marched in Mombasa. Taxi drivers blocked roads in Kisumu. Pastors called for a national fast in Machakos. 25 MPs called for an emergency session. The United Nations issued a statement urging investigation. The African Union remained silent, but the people were not. From rooftops and phones, from radio stations and underground churches, one phrase echoed across a continent: "Let the president answer, or let the people rise." And somewhere in a basement room in Nairobi, surrounded by screens, Ibrahim allowed himself one moment of silence, not the silence of fear, but of completion. He whispered to himself, not in defiance, but in faith: "Truth does not fall, it multiplies." The air in Nairobi had changed. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it wasn't fear anymore either. After the Four Corners drop, after the synchronized exposure of evidence that no one could ignore, something inside the nation cracked open. People no longer looked over their shoulders to whisper. They looked each other in the eyes and spoke, loudly, clearly, together. Markets buzzed with voices not just about prices, but about politics. Churches prayed not just for rain, but for justice. Schools, once silent about current affairs, began organizing discussion circles titled, "What Democracy Means." The spell was broken. President William Ruto denied everything. He called the files deep fakes, the audio AI-generated lies, and Ibrahim an enemy of the state paid by foreign interests. But the world was watching now, and the lie had become too large to carry. In an extraordinary session of Parliament, a motion was introduced for an independent truth commission. The president's allies tried to stall, but the tide had turned. Even within the ruling coalition, dissent began to bubble. People were tired not just of Ruto, but of all the leaders who had worn different names, but used the same playbook of silence and fear. But this story was never really about them. It was about Boniface, about Albert, about Esther, about Luca, about every name that never made it to a headline, every voice that had died in echo chambers, every family that buried truth alongside their children, and most of all, it was about a man named Ibrahim who chose not to be safe, so the rest could be free. When asked by an international reporter, "What now?" Ibrahim smiled, not with triumph, but with calm. "Now we wait to see if the system has enough conscience left to investigate itself." He knew it wouldn't. Not truly, not fully. But that didn't matter, because the people had already done what mattered most. They had remembered. Memory was rebellion, and solidarity was power. The video of Boniface's shooting is now archived in dozens of digital museums, tagged with the words, "The moment silence lost." The mural of his face remains untouched, even as authorities paint over graffiti elsewhere. Children walk past it and point, asking, "Is that the man who made the police scared?" And every time someone answers yes, but only because he refused to be afraid. The church in Ruiru, once abandoned, is now a community library and organizing center. On its wall is a quote painted in black: "Justice is not an event. It is a memory carried by the living." And Ibrahim, he still moves, still hides, but he no longer runs. He teaches online workshops on civic truth. He mentors young journalists, and every Sunday he writes one letter to a family who lost someone, not with answers, but with acknowledgement. That their pain is seen, that their loved one mattered. In one such letter to Boniface's mother he wrote, "I did not know your son, but I heard him fall, and I promise his echo will never fade. I do not write to explain what happened. I write to remind you that he changed something. He showed a nation what courage looks like. He gave us all permission to ask, to resist, to remember. Now, dear viewer, the story returns to you. You have watched, you have heard, you have felt, but truth is never complete until it is shared. This video is not just evidence, it is a tribute, a testimony, a challenge. Share it not for algorithms, but for memory. Share it so the names are not lost. Share it so that when your children ask what you did during the age of silence, you can say, "I chose to listen. I chose to speak." Let your repost be your prayer. Let your comment be your defiance. Let your heart be your compass. Africa does not need saviors. It needs witnesses. It needs firekeepers. It needs you. May Boniface rest in peace. May Albert's name remain unforgotten. May Esther find the strength to teach again. May Ibrahim live long enough to see the world he dreamed of. And may you, yes, you become the kind of person a broken country cannot break. We are not waiting for change. We are the change. As an African citizen reading this story, I am overwhelmed not just by grief or anger, but by clarity. This is not merely a tale of state brutality in Kenya. It is a mirror reflecting the broken systems across many African nations. We have grown too familiar with the silence that follows injustice. We bury victims in the ground, and then we bury their names in our minds, trying to survive. But Ibrahim refused to let memory fade, and in doing so, he taught us something profound. Justice begins when memory is kept alive. Ibrahim's courage is not just admirable, it is instructional. He did not wait for institutions or global watchdogs to act. He collected receipts, exposed names, showed patterns, and followed the money. He taught us that truth in Africa cannot always wait for the law. Sometimes it must ride on the shoulders of ordinary people who refuse to be silenced. And sometimes it is the bloggers, not the generals, who light the way forward. One of the most striking lessons comes from the ordinary citizens in the story Esther Boniface, and even the anonymous janitor at the morgue. These were not politicians or activists. They were people with lives, with families, with dreams. And yet, in the face of injustice, they chose to speak. Esther bribed a pathologist just to reclaim the truth about her husband's death. The janitor whispered facts that the government wanted buried. These acts of small defiance remind us in repressive systems, even telling the truth is an act of revolution. We also learn that fear is never just personal, it is political. The state relies on our fear to function. It counts on our silence as much as it counts on its weapons. But the moment we begin to talk, truly talk, the balance of power shifts. Boniface's death, live-streamed and replayed across the world, showed us that even one bullet cannot erase a story once it has been seen, heard, and felt. The role of digital platforms in this story is another wake-up call. In an age where governments can shut down broadcasts, the people must become the media. The fact that Ibrahim's revelations were spread through Bluetooth Telegram X and anonymous drives proves that truth can no longer be caged. It may be delayed, it may be throttled, but it will find its way through one signal, one share, one upload at a time. Furthermore, the Four Corners drop stands as a new model for African journalism and civic resistance. Coordinated transnational multilingual reporting is not just effective, it is necessary. African regimes often rely on the isolation of dissidents within national borders, but when journalists from Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, and Uganda publish simultaneously, they disrupt that isolation. They turn one man's voice into a continental choir. They make it harder for power to hide. There's also a critical lesson in Ibrahim's refusal to be martyred. Many of our heroes have died young, becoming symbols, but leaving movements without direction. Ibrahim made a different choice. He chose survival over sacrifice. And in doing so, he reminded us that long-term resistance requires strategy, not just sentiment. It needs infrastructure, not just inspiration. He decided to outlive the lie, not just confront it, and that may be his greatest legacy. This story also reveals how state systems evolve under the pretense of modernity. TibaNet, originally designed for public health, was turned into a tool of political surveillance. This is a warning to every African country embracing digital governance. Without strong accountability mechanisms, even noble software can become an engine of oppression. What begins as innovation can quickly turn into infiltration. The financial trail Ibrahim uncovered is a bitter reminder that every act of repression has a price tag, and someone profits from it. In this case, AfriShield Ltd and David Koske represent how personal loyalty and state power can merge into corruption. It forces us to ask in our own countries who funds the fear, who signs the checks that pay for riot gear drones and secret prisons. But perhaps the most important lesson is this: the state's greatest fear is not riots, it is truth. Not the truth whispered in private, but the one shouted in public, recorded on camera, verified by documents, and believed by millions. The regime in the story scrambled only after Ibrahim named names, exposed systems, and released evidence in sync across 4 nations. That is when the lie cracked. That is when power began to panic. As African citizens, we must also reflect on our role. Too often, we wait for a leader to fix everything. But this story reminds us democracy is not a favor granted by those in power. It is a daily duty carried out by those in pain. It is born not in speeches, but in street corners, market stalls, schools, and homes. Boniface wasn't a protester. He was a vendor. But even vendors can become revolutionaries if the state declares survival itself to be resistance. In the end, this story is not just a call for justice in Kenya. It is a continental parable. Whether you live in Zambia or Zimbabwe, Cameroon, or Côte d'Ivoire, you have seen versions of Ojwang. You have heard of Boniface. You have met an Ibrahim. The details may change, but the pattern remains. We must all ask ourselves, what will we do when our government starts deleting voices instead of answering questions? What will we do when policy becomes persecution? Will we look away, or will we like Ibrahim? Remember, in Africa, memory is our strongest weapon, and solidarity is our greatest shield. This story reminds us that even in the darkest hour, we are never truly alone. There is always someone watching, someone documenting, someone resisting. And so we do not mourn this story. We carry it, we spread it, we learn from it. Because as long as we remember, silence cannot win. Now, rise. As an African, I read Ibrahim's story not as a distant observer, but as someone who knows the taste of fear, the weight of silence, and the cost of truth. This is not just a Kenyan story. It is an African story, because what happened to Boniface and Ojwang has happened in different forms across our continent. From Nigeria to Sudan, from Cameroon to Zimbabwe, we have all witnessed the quiet normalization of state brutality. We have all whispered warnings to our children, telling them not to speak too loudly, not to question too much, not to stand too close. But Ibrahim reminded us that survival without dignity is not living, that freedom is not a gift given by presidents, but a right claimed by people who refuse to forget. His defiance is not just heroic, it is familiar. In every African township and slum, there are people like Ibrahim, people who once believed in change through peaceful means until their friends were buried and their families threatened. People who chose exile only to return with a voice sharpened by distance. I felt the ache in Esther's voice when she opened that wooden box in a dimly lit church. I thought of all the African mothers who carry more grief than groceries. I thought of how often we are told to move on, to forgive, to forget, when what we really need is acknowledgement. Not pity, not promises, just the truth spoken aloud for the world to hear. As Africans, we are taught from a young age that institutions are not for us, that justice is a favor, that questioning is danger. But Ibrahim challenged this lie. He went beyond hashtags and slogans. He investigated, he documented, he connected dots that were never meant to be joined, and most importantly, he gave names to the unnamed. Boniface, Ojwang, Luka. He turned victims into witnesses. He turned a system built on silence into a battlefield of facts. We have always known that our governments are capable of betrayal. But what stings more is how predictable the denials are. He hanged himself. It was an isolated incident. We're investigating. These statements are like broken records in African politics. And yet, for the first time in a long time, someone disrupted that cycle. Someone answered those lies with evidence and then multiplied it across languages, across borders, across firewalls. I remember watching the Four Corners drop. The way it synchronized, the way it echoed across the continent, it felt like a digital uprising. For once, we were not waiting for the BBC or CNN to validate our suffering. We did it ourselves. And in doing so, we reclaimed not just the narrative, but our own sense of agency. It reminded me that African journalism doesn't have to beg for international attention. It can lead. But the most powerful lesson came from the people, not from Ibrahim, but from the market women who shared the video, from the students in Mombasa who painted Boniface's face on a wall, from the taxi drivers in Kisumu who blocked roads in protest. These weren't activists, they were citizens who finally saw themselves in the victims. Because we all know what it feels like to be invisible, to be stepped on without consequence, to be told to shut up because this is Africa. No, this is not just Africa. This is a continent rising, a continent where even silence now has cracks. And inside those cracks, voices are blooming. Ibrahim showed us that revolution doesn't always start with a gunshot. Sometimes it starts with a spreadsheet, an autopsy report, or a leaked memo. He weaponized the truth. He didn't just accuse, he proved. And that distinction is important for us Africans. We are often painted by our leaders as emotional, irrational, ungrateful. But Ibrahim's work showed that we are also meticulous, strategic, and relentless. And yes, there is a risk. Every time someone like Ibrahim speaks, there is a price to be paid. Disappearance, discredit, death. But this is the choice many Africans now face: die slowly in silence or live boldly in resistance. To be African today is to constantly balance hope and heartbreak. But stories like this one tilt the balance. They remind us that even when justice feels far, dignity is near. It is in our refusal to look away. It is in the way we say the names of the dead as if they were still breathing. It is in the murals, the vigils, the marches, the whispered prayers on crowded buses. We are not just reacting, we are remembering. And in that memory lies our future. The church in Ruiru becoming a library that is Africa. That is the Africa we dream of, not one ruled by fear, but shaped by courage. Not one hiding in silence, but building sanctuaries from it. As an African, I walk away from this story with more than sorrow. I walk away with instruction. That every WhatsApp group can become a news outlet. That every mother's cry can become a manifesto. That every child pointing at Boniface's mural is already learning what it means to demand better. We were told to wait, to be patient, to develop, but no more. Ibrahim's story is our signal. Africa is done waiting. Now it is watching. It is remembering. It is speaking. And if truth is dangerous, then so be it. We were never meant to live forever in silence. Let the world know we may have been afraid, but we are no longer asleep. The fire has been lit, and we, the people of Africa, intend to keep it burning.